Today's fireside chat is with Saikat Chakrabarti. And if you're here watching, you probably already know a bit about him, but just to sort of summarize, he started a company called Mockingbird. He was a founding engineer at Stripe, and then he worked on the tech side of the Bernie campaign. And with some other Bernie alumni, founded the organizations Brand New Congress and Justice Democrats, which led to being the campaign manager and chief of staff for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. In her office, he led the authorship of the Green New Deal. And then since leaving the office, he has started an organization called the New Consensus, as well as a podcast called Building the Dream. And we'll get a lot more into all of that later. But just to start off, I was curious, sort of jumping back to the beginning, you did make this big transition from working in tech to working in politics. So how and why did that come about?
Yeah, well, thanks. It's good to meet you in person, Trevor, by the way.
Yeah, nice to meet you too.
And also, it's really good to see Amber and Nelhaj and a bunch of Stripe folks on here after a long time. But yeah, I mean, the transition, it wasn't, it's like whenever people tell their stories in hindsight, there's like, well, I had this moment and I just figured it all out and it just like fell into place. But I was honestly like, I'd been working at Stripe for a couple of years. Really liked it. I mean, it was, and I hear still is a great place to work. But I was getting a little disillusioned with just, I guess, like the state of the world and San Francisco and the Bay Area overall. I kind of came into Silicon Valley kind of at the height of tech is going to change the world. If you want to solve the biggest problems in the world, go to Silicon Valley, work there, and this future utopia is going to come about. And it's felt at the time like that wasn't exactly happening, not like because of Stripe or any particular reason. It just was like, you live in San Francisco and there's billionaire high rises going up while homelessness is getting worse. And so I just like quit and wasn't sure what to do. And at the time I really was interested in like, what can I do about these really big problems like climate change and economic inequality, which was getting worse and worse. And a few months later, Bernie Sanders started his presidential run. He just kind of walked out onto a random park and announced it, and it was pretty great. But the inspiring thing about his run was like he was not necessarily saying all the biggest solutions at the time, and I was totally apolitical, so I didn't know what the solutions were. He was like campaigning on like a carbon tax, but he was talking about these big problems and actually like talking about them honestly and attracting these massive crowds. So that got me inspired. It made me think like, well, maybe this is a route to actually work on the big problems in the world. And I got sucked in. I started just doing it as a volunteer coder. There was this Reddit group, Coders for Sanders, and it was a total chaotic like mess, but I tried to do what I could. But and then pounded the door until I got connected with someone in the campaign and was part of this amazing distributed organizing program that's like its own whole story. But I caught the bug through that because the whole Bernie campaign experience, while total chaos and so much dysfunction and all kinds of crazy stuff there was this feeling of, holy crap, something big could change. And there is a movement of people out there who want that to happen. And we got far enough that something big seemed at least plausible, even if we didn't pull it off.
For sure. Yeah. And so then leaving that campaign, I think you sort of started another attempt at something big, which was Brand New Congress. And then I think you merged with Justice Democrats, which was also Bernie alumni. Can you talk a bit about what the
it was,
was?
Both of those were the same people basically, but
okay.
But yeah, like towards the end of the Bernie campaign, there was maybe a bit of a flight of delusion where we're like, holy crap, we almost did it. We almost won this big presidential race with a total no-name person. I mean, he's a senator, but kind of a relatively no-name person. And but we were doing these events as staffers. We're doing these things called barnstorms, where basically we would show up in like random states. I'll give a little bit of background. The whole team that I was part of, presidential primaries, you have the first 4 states, and that's where like all the staff goes, and that's what everybody focuses on. And on the Bernie campaign in 2016, we originally didn't have, as much money as the Clinton campaign, but we had all these people in all their states who wanted to do something. And the Bernie staff like had no resources to put on them. So they just like hired like 5 people initially, and I was on that team to just figure out what to do with those millions of other people, and we're like, okay, so we devised this plan to like do this distributed organizing thing. But part of that was we would go to the states, do these events where it was just staff, and even just Bernie staff showing up, you'd get like a few hundred, sometimes 1,000 people would show up to these events to hear, piddly old us talk. But the thing we would hear over and over, was like, if Bernie becomes president, this is at the height of like Obama obstructionism that was going on. What are we going to do about Congress? It's totally broken. Republicans are going to obstruct everything. Democrats probably might even obstruct some of the stuff. And so we thought like, well, we just saw this national movement raise millions of dollars because it just caught steam. And it's like this snowball effect that happens where you can sometimes kind of like hack the mainstream media to where they'll cover a story, which causes momentum, which creates a new story. And there's just like the cycle effect. And that's really what happened in the Bernie campaign. So we thought, can we pull that off, but focusing on Congress and basically try to take over all of Congress at once to get an actual agenda through, And so we launched this group called Brand New Congress, which the goal of it was to recruit over 400 people. Originally it was 535 people, like basically every seat, run someone for every seat. But a big part of it was they would be running together. Like if this was any other country, I would just say we were going to start a new party, and it would just make a lot of sense. But in America, I have to have to like explain this whole concept. But basically, we have a team of people running together, and they had a specific plan of rebuilding America. It wasn't, and part of it was the Bernie stuff, like a better social safety net, healthcare for everybody. But a big part of it that really no one at that time was talking about, right or left, was this idea of invest in America and American industry and actively like take on this project-like mindset to solve deindustrialization, solve climate change, not just a carbon tax, which is what Bernie was running on in 2016, but actually figure out what would it take to replace every fossil fuel vehicle, on the street. How much money would that take? How would you plan it out? And so we put that agenda together. We started trying to recruit people. Turns out recruiting 400 people, not so easy. We came up with a process that was like, I'd say like a good quality filter, but it took freaking forever. It was like 4 months from like first contact to finally getting someone to like run. And we were looking for like, there's a bunch of kind of new things about this idea. One was like this idea of like recruiting foreign people running all together. And there's new stuff in the actual, plan that people were running on. And then we wanted to recruit people who were not like career politicians and people who were actually community leaders and good, like the principal that like turned his or her school around, or, the factory worker who is like the leader that actually like solves the problems on the factory floor and like figures stuff out and gets stuff done. These people who would never in a million years consider running for anything as messy as Congress. And that was like such an opposition, until we launched this before Donald Trump was elected. And we talked to a bunch of folks who we would, pitch them this idea, and they would just like kind of look at us funny and just the, main question is like, why, right now I'm directly helping students in my school, or I'm, directly doing this thing. Why would I possibly run for Congress? So that was just this huge barrier. We met, Donald Trump getting elected was honestly one of the things that made it a little bit easier for us to get those kinds of people to run, because there was this sudden sense of like, okay, maybe things are worse than I thought in the country.
Right.
And a bunch of folks that we talked to early on actually end up running even without us, and a few of them won. But to summarize the whole thing, I don't want to keep going on this, but like, we ended up recruiting about 12 people. One of those was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And so we switched gears on the strategy. We realized we wouldn't get this big national campaign to take over all of Congress with. So could we instead do something that would be impactful and at least changing where the Democratic Party is pushing and where they're headed, so
Right.
they can be a powerful opposition force to Republicans, And when it became clear that all 12 of our recruited candidates were all going to lose as well, we basically went Hail Mary for a bunch of reasons, but Hail Mary and all in on AOC's campaign. I went up there and ran the campaign. But basically, that point where we switched from like big national 400 people campaign to like let's just try to like primary some Democrats and try to push it that way, change the Democratic Party. We launched a new group called Justice Democrats that was like primarily focused on that. We teamed up with a media network called the Young Turks, which was it's basically a way to get exposure. And yeah, and then after it was a Hail Mary that ended up sort of working out better than I would have expected. but yeah, we managed to get that one victory with AOC, and we also did endorse. Once because Donald Trump getting elected did get a bunch of excellent people to start running of their own volition. Right. So we started endorsing people that were running, and Ayanna Pressley, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib were people we endorsed, and they end up winning with our help as well.
Got it. So am I understanding correctly that even in founding Brand New Congress, you already sort of had the vision for the kind of Green New Deal style policies that you wanted to pursue with that?
Yeah. I mean, it was, we weren't calling it the Green New Deal at the time. We had all kinds of names, and honestly, Green New Deal even wasn't the name we wanted. It was literally the night before. AOC hated that name. Like the night before the sit-in in Pelosi's office, we were like, well, it's time. We got it. We need a name now. So whatever it is. And she was like, all right, fine, we'll go with the Green New Deal. But yeah, it was, I would say it wasn't so focused on climate change either. Like we sort of thought of like this economic approach to solving problems. The Green New Deal is like one of the use cases. It's like one of the ways to apply that to the specific problem of climate change, which everyone understands. But it's like at the time that we started Brand New Congress, we were also talking about like what would be the approach, things like rampant homelessness and the housing crisis all across the country. How would you tackle that? Or like especially in deindustrialized parts of the country where we started the whole thing in Knoxville. So we were hanging out in East Tennessee, which is this used to be this furniture corridor. And one of my co-founders, Corbin, he used to actually be run a furniture manufacturing business that just got wiped out by NAFTA, And so like, what's the way to mobilize to build up new industry there and do work there and like revitalize those downtowns? So that it had all that stuff in there, but yeah, we end up focusing on the Green New Deal part because that encompasses so much. A lot of the other things I mentioned kind of can go along with it, and it's easier to understand rather than this like,
right,
you have a new economic theory to fix stuff,
right,
which is not new.
Got it. So that's what you've been working on now with the new consensus, is sort of this broader vision, which includes the Green New Deal. Yeah. Can you talk a bit about how you see that being possible? Like, obviously, the idea of revitalizing sort of American manufacturing and innovation is attractive, but how do we go about making that happen?
You mean like economically or politically? Because I think those are two.
Economically, yeah.
Yeah. So, a lot of it's like, sometimes it's hard to explain because I think it's kind of such a simple concept for anyone who like works in a business. It's just like you just set goals and do them. So we took the same sort of mindset and put it on to say like, what could a response to a COVID crisis be? So at New Consensus, we put out some docs at the beginning of the end of February that were basically saying, here what can we do to both end the pandemic and provide the economic relief, and it basically like boils down to stuff like, well, we know we need to build N95 masks, right? Which we still don't make enough of. It's sort of crazy. It's like these cheap paper, like 90 cents to produce masks, but we don't make them, and why aren't we making them? Like, why don't companies just launch into action if there's all this demand and make them, right? And turns out, and I've done a couple of like talked to a few people who like know a little bit about this, and it's just, it's all these things like, A, companies don't have the capital necessarily to put in to create new mask manufacturing plants. B, they don't know if it's this risky thing. Maybe they make a bunch of masks and the pandemic ends and then they're left holding a bag. That exact thing happened to a bunch of mask manufacturers and during the swine flu, and C, like, there's a little bit of just laziness in there. Like, why, if you're already making good money doing something, why do something new? And a lot of those problems, like with stuff like the Green New Deal, we often talk about World War II, just because that was like the last time we had a big mobilization of our economy. And the same problems showed up then too. Like, it was, even like the government started by trying to just say, we're gonna, buy all the planes you produce, but then no one was going to retool their plans to make planes and cars and trucks. And then the government started guaranteeing profits, but still not enough. So then the government started building factories for them, and then leasing them out, and that started to become kind of enough, but it still wasn't always enough. So then it was like, it's like there's no one size fits all solution to just solving this problem. It's more of an approach of saying, this is something we want to do. We want to build 30,000 planes, and we will use all the tools in our chest, whether that's like the market or government run corporations or a combination of the two. If CEOs are not doing their job, then we're going to replace them. If workers are striking and that's getting too much in the way, we're going to go in and mediate and try to like figure out how to get progress. Right. And so that mindset, it's funny because Trump, with his he had these like daily press briefings, he kind of like emulated the showmanship of that mindset. Actually, like, he started talking about a mobilization to build ventilators and masks and produce stuff, and he brought all the CEOs of the wrong companies, but he brought up, he did bring up a bunch of like Walgreens CEOs and stuff, being like, you guys are going to put testing in all of your parking lots, and he made this show of doing mobilization, which is really similar to what we did in World War II. Yeah, and in World War II we did the same thing, but then we actually like followed through, and he just kind of
right.
did it right. So it's like not a new thing. It's just this idea of seeing your economy as a tool to use to solve problems, and mobilizing sections, or if needed, the whole part of it to do so. And then using the tools in your chest. I mean, like, the system, this kind of thinking is like very like Hamiltonian. It was called like the American system of economics before we exported it to essentially China and other countries, so that's all we're really talking about, is like just getting back to a mindset of like, let's take some initiative to solve these problems. I don't know if I actually answered your question. I feel like I went on a tangent there.
No, totally answered it.
Okay.
So I'm curious, because I find that very exciting, but there are a lot of people who are currently running the government who might not necessarily be invested in that kind of vision yet. So what is sort of your political theory of change for how we could actually go about convincing people, or whatever else we need to do, kicking them out to get this started?
Yeah, I don't have like all this stuff. Whenever it comes to political theories, I'm like, half confident in what I'm saying is correct and maybe is bullshit. But I still really think like that the way to successfully pull off a mobilization, like to solve climate change, for example, that's a good one to think about, because you have to have leaders who are actually motivated to go all the way and keep pushing and keep succeeding. I really think you have to have people elect, like a group of people really elected into power, who are driven by that goal and vision to actually do it, and they don't need constant public pressure to remind them to go to the next step, just because that's so, imagine if FDR had to have constant pressure to like fight the Nazis. Of course we would have lost, like it's it is. So that's why I'm still pretty invested in the idea of, and my ulterior motive with the podcast, we don't really think is going to be a big podcast, because how was the chance of that? But we do want to like try to find leaders like that to try to get, in my dream, it would be like we get another group of like 30 or 40 or 50 or 100 people together running as a team. And that's a big component of it, is like you actually need to be working together as a team with this goal. And you're not just like going in to do some horse trading and do some politics. You're actually going in to like solve these problems. And that's your success case. It's not a success case to just like, get a carbon tax passed. So that to me is like, I guess is like kind of a political revolution theory of change, and it's like literally the way, if you look at countries that have ever really changed their economic stagnation, it's often, I mean, unfortunately, many times it's been through war, and other times it's been through some form of revolution, right? And we don't like the violent kind. I would much rather have the democratic kind that happens through our political process. But you know, countries like South Korea or Singapore, like the whole thing I'm talking about is kind of just basically taking that basic developmental mindset of, if you know, when someone like Park Hee, who in many ways, you know, was an authoritarian dictator, that, you know, there's a lot of bad stuff about him, but he took over South Korea and with his party, and had this like laser focus on developing the country, you know, and putting in 10, 20, 30, 40-year long plans to do so, and that worked, you know. And I think that's kind of the closest equivalent I think we have in the US. Our eras, like, you know, when FDR came in with a team of New Dealers, and there was sort of a team there, you know, it wasn't so cohesive as like the Lee Kuan Yew's party in Singapore, Park Geun-hye's party in South Korea, but there was some cohesion at least, and there's some goal of exactly what to fix, the Great Depression, and then, you know, fighting the Nazis, and actually, you know, like the other time I'd say we'd had sort of a political revolution democratically in the U.S. was the Reagan Revolution, which at that time, you know, we'd had basically like 40 years of like democratic majorities that were, but, you know, they were letting so many problems get worse and worse and worse and slide, that a whole new generation of Republicans were able to tell a credible story to take power and do it. So so I'd say primary theory of political change is, we'll love to get a group of like the equivalent of the Reagan Revolution happening, but with an actual theory to fix stuff, not just like dismantle our government. You know, but I have been surprised, honestly, by like how much just little threats to power of Democrats has accomplished. You know, like in the sense of, we did you know, AOC won her primary. There's been a few other primary challenges, but just that was enough to like make Joe Biden the most radical climate change president we've ever had running in this country, right? So that's encouraging.
No, definitely. We have a question from the chat, which is, given the passing of RBG, what role do you think the Supreme Court will play in enabling or obstructing this agenda? And
Yeah.
also maybe more broadly, like, how do we overcome those institutional barriers that are already in place that would be sort of trying to stop anybody coming in working on this stuff?
Yeah, you know, I think that if you look at actually how the three branches of our government have like evolved over history, you know, it's never been like set in stone. You know, it's never been like, this is exactly how it works and everyone always follows the rules. There's been this constant shifting of power from some branches to others, and I'd say currently the biggest shift of power has been, for over the last, you know, decade, has been going from Congress to the executive branch and the Supreme Court, and that's really because Congress is just like refusing to govern. You know, Congress is not legislating, Congress is not making laws, Congress is not doing its job, which makes the Supreme Court such a more powerful body in our government. And
Right.
so the answer, you know, is like, the Supreme Court, you know, absolutely could be, you know, an obstruction, but it can be a much smaller obstruction than we're allowing it to be currently, if we actually got legislators willing to legislate. And then your question, Trevor, was about just like institutional barriers. Yeah, you know, same thing. It's like there's a lot of stuff in the U.S. political system that make it difficult. You know, even the stuff I'm talking about, like a new set of leaders pop up and take power. That's so much easier in like parliamentary systems in some ways, right? Because you can just start a party, offer an answer, you know, when the country is looking for one, and there's a credible option to vote for. So you have to be a bit more creative in our system, which is hard. But I do have faith that like that I think our system, you know, is flexible enough that I have faith that we can actually get big stuff done, and that should be like the primary driver. Like I think we could do it even in a way to where like a Senate is a big obstruction to getting like a progressive agenda done, but you can create an agenda that also will really help the lives of people in rural communities and not have the Senate necessarily be a Republican body. I mean, right now is just neither party has done anything for so long that there's no credible reason to believe either one, the other side will ever do something for you, right? Or vice versa.
Right. Another question from the chat relevant to what you were just saying. What are the reasons that you think it would be very hard or impossible to start a new party in the US?
So there's one that's just like straight legal reasons, which is the actual path to starting a party and keeping your party is really hard. The rules vary from state to state, but you basically have to like get a ridiculous number of petition signatures in a ridiculously short amount of time, win a certain percentage of the vote every time. I mean, like the Green Party's been trying this for years and they still can't get on the presidential ballot in every state. Working Families Party basically can only do it in New York. There's a chicken and egg problem, which, I sort of have this belief in like, not belief just because I sort of saw it play out a few times where I think it's possible sometimes to catch the national like imagination and get like a ton of progress all of a sudden. And, in that moment, some of these institutional barriers against a party become a lot lessened. So, for example, like in the first couple of weeks of like the George Floyd protests, there was this national spotlight, on the protests. And if there was a political movement at the same time, I think that would have been a moment where it could have actually taken a lot of power all at once and really quickly. But then there's this other piece in the US, which is just like the sheer, the first past the poll kind of voting system we have makes it so that there's always this threat of being a spoiler party. But, of course, some states have some solutions for that with like ranked choice voting. But yeah, it's difficult and there's a stigma to it as a result of the difficulty.
For sure. Yeah. Another sort of relevant question from the chat, given that that's not immediately feasible and instead the Just Democrats have turned to this vision of sort of putting this primary pressure on the Democrats and getting as many people as possible in these safe districts into Congress. What do you think is sort of the tipping point for the number of people who would have to actually be there to be able to get this sort of ambitious agenda done? Like, would it be feasible if it was just in the 10% of congressional seats that are the most solidly Democratic?
I hope it is, but I don't think it is. This is why I still sort of think like, I think getting an agenda like this done requires you to actually hold state power. So I don't think you can be a minority coalition partner currently we're the Democrats are basically like a minority coalition partner in a minority government, right? And so like, so no, I think you have to actually like hold the gavel and hold the presidency, and that requires at least being a majority of the Democratic Party. The thing I don't know, and this is where I'm like hopeful is, is 10%, is winning 10% of the seats enough to actually convince the people who currently have power to break off to your segment, right? And like start working with you as a team as opposed to the current team. And I'm not sure, there's an interesting result that just happened in, I forget if it was Rhode Island or Delaware. I think it was Rhode Island, where there's a group of people there. They actually, we had talked to them like a few years ago, but they basically tried to do like a brand new Congress style thing for Rhode Island. Had a bunch of the same sort of problems. They didn't, they weren't running someone for every seat, but they got way further than we did. They got like 20 or 30 candidates running, and they just won a bunch of seats. They won like 6 or 7 or maybe 10, I don't remember, somewhere between 6 and 10 seats. Still nowhere near a majority of the Rhode Island legislature, but it was enough of a threat to the power where there's a lot of people, if the chatter is to be believed, who are now thinking, if the majority leader can't even help me keep my seat, then should I follow the majority leader, right? So that's like one way you can try to like take power within the party. But no, I mean, I still like the reason I sometimes whenever I pitch the idea of like a bunch of people running all together and take power all at once, it sounds to some people like that's like the harder approach versus like winning these primaries one by one and slowly like clawing power within the party. But then we just keep seeing examples over and over again, both with Trump in the US, but other right-wing governments around the world, or just like insurgent governments like in Ukraine, where that's exactly what happens. I just think it's actually easier to get more power and enough power to like do something big if you just go big and appeal straight to the national, appeal to people directly, right? Instead of trying to go through the party leaders and the gatekeepers, because the other problem with winning within the Democratic Party a little bit, and like this is all going to come down to, are the Justice Democrats able to hold everyone together as like their own thing? Is it's so hard within the Democratic Party to do that, like it's not from like a, twisting your mustache, I'm going to sell out kind of way. It's like, there is this pressure to like get the small stuff done. And if you start trying to work with your colleagues to get the small stuff done, there's a lot of pressure to not challenge them politically or not challenge to get the bigger thing done, And so it's not like people sell out. But I do think it's hard for people not to want to sell short, because if there's like a chance to get something done today at the expense, and it is often at the expense of getting something bigger done, tomorrow, then why not get, is it even believable to get the bigger thing done tomorrow?
Right. So I'm curious, given all of that sort of pressure on people once they're in office, and in particular, a lot of people on the left will talk about how, even if we were to have a lot of electoral success, AOC is president and we have a brand new Congress, still once they started to implement these policies, there would be a lot of resistance from sort of business and capital in terms of, moving things out of the US and sort of trying to resist that in any way possible. So a lot of people on the left feel like another necessary component of this is having sort of strong labor organization and being able to actually like fight back actively with strikes in terms of sort of having that class struggle play out. Do you see that as a necessary part of accomplishing this agenda, or do you think that just the sort of electoral success is enough to actually make it happen?
Oh no, I mean, I think electoral success is like step half of enacting the agenda. And it's not just going to be opposition from business. There's all kinds of entrenched special interests that are benefiting from the current status quo. I mean, look at housing in San Francisco, right? Like, it's not just like business interests that don't want to solve this problem that would benefit everybody, and it usually boils down to like this like common problem. Like everyone has their own special thing that is short-term benefiting them, even if they know long-term the game's going to be up. Like companies in America that would be trying to fight against like a active agenda of progress because short-term they'll make less money, but long-term you won't have a business, like, but that long-term may be like 10, 20, 30 years in the future. If like America stops being a country that, is producing anything and we lose our position in the world. So like the way I sort of view this stuff is like currently, I do think America is like declining, not just from a standpoint of we're letting our citizens down, like life expectancy is going down and all, at every stat of like actual well-being and quality of life, we're starting to do worse and worse. But also just from a standpoint of like, we're no longer being the country that's like investing in building the new stuff, like when people think of where the countries are that are going to be building the next economy, building a clean economy, people don't think that's America, and I don't think that's the way stuff's going around is going to be America. It's probably going to be in Asia. It's probably going to be in some parts of Europe. And so in that environment where there's less and less, in some ways, less and less actual stuff. And there's a separate question of like, yes, our GDP is going up because of how the economy is structured and financialization, but like less and less stuff, the class struggle gets harder and harder. And I see this playing out with our unions currently. Like there aren't, most union fights are often to like unionize like small things, fight for small stuff. It's declining. And so I think the chance to actively build and grow, like when you think of an agenda like the Green New Deal, whenever I talk to economists or folks working on it, the real challenge that I don't know if we have an answer to is not going to be anything other than labor. Like there's just so much work to do to change the energy infrastructure of our entire economy that we may not have enough people, even if we try to bring in as many people as we can from all over the country to pull it off. In that environment, the labor movement gets a lot of power, and in that environment, there's like a bigger pie for the class struggle to play out in, and for capital and labor to, because that fight between capital and labor, that tension will just exist as long as we have our current economic system. I mean, it's a different thing if you're talking about going full communism, then yeah, sure, maybe that's different. But we live in America, so we're going to have that class struggle. But but the way I view it is, I think the class struggle is not the thing that will build the new future. It's like, but if we're building the new future, then we should let the class struggle happen to make sure it's an equitable future, and like labor is getting its fair share.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. Cool. Given that sort of vision, I'm curious about your thoughts on the Biden campaign sort of gesturing in this direction. I think since he won the primary, there's been people on his team sort of indicating that he wants to at least be seen as sort of FDR style president of like, I'm a moderate, but I'm taking power in this sort of moment of crisis. And so I'm going to move to the left to create sweeping change to do that. And he's specifically released some programs which are sort of a like light version of the Green New Deal, and obviously not going far enough in terms of addressing climate change or creating jobs, but I think pretty transparently meant to be a gesture in that direction.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm curious, like, do you buy it? Do you think that this is like a meaningful step in that direction? And if not, then how can we make it more real?
Yeah. It's hard to have worked in Congress and not feel a little cynical about everybody, but I think the moment has changed a lot in the country, and like, so I'm going to give a quick example of something that happened in the Obama administration and how I think that might relate this time. So Obama, they, part of the Recovery Act, they had a few like investment programs that they started, and some of it was quite successful, and but some of it was like they had this building retrofitting program, right? And they had budgeted about $4 billion for it, and I think only about an eighth of it, that money even got mobilized. And I remember talking to this one congressperson who was at the time, I think, put in charge of part of that program, and he was just saying, this is just failure of a program because like just ran into like all kind, like every state and municipality had their own building codes and regulations. No one was in charge of the federal government to actually like cut through all that. The money wasn't, it was like hard to get the money, all the usual stuff that you hear about like why a government program might not work, right? So with the Biden administration, I do think there's now enough pressure on them, both from just like, not just like, the left or progressives, but I actually think from like a big part of the people who will get him elected, there'll be pressure to do something. It's no longer this election to just like get elected for a Democratic president. I think he's getting elected with a mandate to do something. But I do wonder, I think the pressure is on like getting a bill passed. And then there's this other 90% of the problem of actually executing on that bill, and like, and making a plan, putting people in charge, holding them accountable, getting the projects done. So the part that I'm optimistic about with the Biden program is like, if that part happens, if he actually executes on, like a big building retrofitting project, which would be a ton of jobs, or if he executes on like some of the automobile stuff he's talking about, that would be such a chance to just at least show, yes, it's not nearly enough to like, do anything, make a real dent in climate change, but it would just show that we're capable of doing something again as a country, which is like, I don't think anyone believes. So that's exciting. Do I think he's going to do it? I don't know. I don't know if it's sort of going to depend on like who he puts in charge. I don't think he's the one, that like knows how to lead a thing like that. I don't think that's how he thinks at all, but maybe someone sneaks in and like gets put in charge of the National Recovery Act, essentially. I'm not sure. So there's some hope in there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another question from the chat about sort of how to accomplish that. given that today there's sort of maybe a reputation that progressives avoid playing dirty, this person says, or playing hardball in the way that the GOP sort of does more often and seems more comfortable with. Do you think that that kind of political approach is necessary to get this stuff done? I don't know if maybe they mean things like eliminating the filibuster or packing courts or whatever else. But do you think that's necessary? And if so, how would we go about changing that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. So this is the thing, is I don't think there's like, it's all about like actually being strategic in the moment, getting your team aligned and going for it. Like with the when some there's no reason to play hardball for hardball's sake, especially if it's going to be unpopular. But just be strategic. Like I think, say Biden becomes president and or a progressive president became president. I always dream of this scenario where like we want to replace the fleet of cars in America. And if Biden was president, he brings up exactly what Trump did in the press conference. He brings up the CEOs of the big four, on stage, and he makes them promise to the American public what they're going to do and when they're going to do it by. And he just makes their life hell, to everybody, and embarrasses the shit out of them. And like, does this like show of it. And that's playing hardball, that's not being nice to the CEOs, but it's a very different kind. Like, I think it's a kind of thing that would be exciting. There'd be drama, media would cover it, and people would be excited by it. Like people would be on Biden's side. And that is the kind of thing like FDR would do often. He would make heroes and enemies of people who are aligning with the agenda, and if they're blocking or progress, and they would become enemies. So yeah, I do think like there should be way more of that, not necessarily just from progressives, but from Democrats. I think right now, if I had to like sum up kind of the mindset I often saw play out in like the Democratic caucus in Congress, it's a lot of like trying to find excuses for not doing stuff, like lose the fight and then try to blame the GOP for why we couldn't do things. I just think that never will work, because people don't, it seems whiny, but B, people don't have a memory that far back to remember, oh, the GOP were hypocrites, Lindsey Graham had said this and now he's saying that. I just don't, like, it is what it is. People want actual action. They don't want to be involved in that kind of infighting. Whereas like if it's something like, there could be ways, there are political tools you could use to get your stuff through. And you should, if you have power, I think you should use it to try to do the thing you're trying to do.
Right. To actually accomplish your goals.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, you mentioned working with sort of corporate leaders, and obviously for a lot of people here, they've been involved in big tech for a long time. And I'm just curious, like obviously a lot of your vision is sort of setting aside this 90s era dream that everybody in the US economy would just start working on tech and finance and we can leave manufacturing behind, and saying, no, actually we do need all of that. But presumably tech will still continue existing. So in your vision of the new economy, what happens to tech? Is it, some people on the left have talked about breaking up tech companies, like Elizabeth Warren. Others are excited about things like nationalization. Like, what do you see happening there?
Yeah, no, we're gonna, you guys are all first against the wall in the revolution. No, I'm joking. So this is another, like, I guess, are you asking specifically about like kind of antitrust stuff with like big tech companies, or are you talking about like kind of tech ecosystem and like VCs?
Sort of either way. I was thinking of antitrust, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, with antitrust, I think there is a problem right now, just from a pure, like, I think startups are good for most economies and like the ecosystem. I think the US is actually kind of coming to a low point. It was, at least as of a year or two ago. I think it may still be like at one of its lowest points ever of creating new companies and creating startups. And Silicon Valley and the tech ecosystem overall, like, went through this explosion of startups and then this period of consolidation, which is just something that happens in like capitalist systems. You end up in consolidation periods where big, mega corps sort of take over. And like, I think it's, again, there's no like one, I don't think I'm someone who just thinks breaking up all the tech companies will fix everything. I think it's sort of like a case by case approach. I do think there's like, so like one way, for example, solve that specific problem of there's not enough startups is like we could create a new industry. The same way that the tech industry was originally, there's a big investment from government, and not just in like DARPA creating the internet, but also in continuing capital. Like Apple got its first, one of its first checks from a government small business program. Like there's all this like actual effort to do industrial policy and build that industry. So we could do that again with any number of new fields. And that's one way to tackle that specific problem of like startups not happening. If the question is like, do tech companies being so big, is there like specific problems with like, with Amazon essentially owning the entire retail market? I think it may actually make sense to break up Amazon, or potentially make parts of it like a utility. Same with some parts of Mason, like Twitter. I don't have a very, I think like, I don't think I have a very like one size fits all answer on that. Like some big companies are good by being big, so I think like it does make sense for some companies sometimes to be big, but a lot of the cases of tech companies where they're doing specifically anti-competitive practices, you can try to regulate, but if it doesn't work, then yeah, I think I think you would have to use antitrust and break them up.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I will say I do think Warren's specific proposal, if I recall correctly, was not my favorite. I remember it was a little bit blunt, is the way I'd put it.
How so?
I think she just didn't really like. There's some amount of, I'm trying to remember which.
I think the proposal was to separate all of the marketplaces from what was selling in them, so Apple wouldn't be able to have apps in their store. Amazon wouldn't be able to have
I was
products
thinking
in
of
their
like
store.
she had a proposal when she was running for president that was like just breaking everything up. Is that the same one you're talking about?
Yeah, it was that, and then it was also, let's just roll back a bunch of acquisitions like of Instagram and WhatsApp from Facebook and all of that.
Right. So that's the
Yeah.
part where I remember thinking, I'm not sure exactly how that would work, I think, but I'm sure she had thought about it because she's Elizabeth.
Yeah. Right. So another big sort of tech policy question right now, particularly in California, is around Prop 22, the response to AB5.
Yeah.
And I'm curious just sort of how you see gig work fitting into your vision for the new economy. I mean, is it something that needs to continue and that should be regulated? Do you think it's just sort of an artifact of a weak labor market that will evaporate once there are better options, or how do you see that?
So it's a little bit of both. Like, I think our current gig economy, it does have a lot of like, it's just, we have a weak labor market. We, have a lack of new industries and stuff for people to work in, and people are desperate to just make a buck wherever they can. And there is a lot of that going on, but this is again another one of those places where like I don't think there's like some specific like way. I do think a gig economy, or like the idea of workers being flexible, is good, right? And like one way that could happen is you could have a very strong, there's one definition of employment, everyone is an employee for employer, but you change the definition of employment so that you could be employed by multiple employers, and changing jobs is much easier. Or you could have multiple jobs. Like I think the current definitions we have of like employment and contract work are like very flawed, and kind of fundamentally flawed, where the idea that you become a contract worker also means you can never have any kind of benefits.
Right.
It creates the wrong incentive structure. And there's plenty of countries that like do this stuff in different ways and can get it to work better, so like in like on the benefits question, like in Denmark, for example, the way they've set stuff up is, I don't actually know how they exactly handle gig workers, but basically they have like an almost 100% unionized workforce. And the whole structure of union bargaining is this like this standard thing that happens every year, and it can be contentious. I'm not saying it's like, it's all great and workers and capital, they're all just getting along. It can be contentious, but it's a known thing that happens. The unions are strong. They don't even have a minimum wage there, but the unions are strong enough that they are basically able to set a prevailing wage every year. And and the major negotiations happen for a contract between these national like union, it's like a union collaborate, like a group of unions and a national trade organization, and then those contracts get used to determine everyone else's contracts, right? That sounds good. If we can pull that off, I think that'd be great. You know, like that'd be a good way to do it. And then the question of are you a gig worker or an employee doesn't matter, because that's really not the thing we care about. I think the thing we care about is like, can you have a dignified life as a worker with benefits and healthcare and all these other things that employers, we've created this like zombie system for employers to have to essentially substitute in for things that should be like social safety net programs from the government, right? And like, which I think is bad for workers for all the reasons, like it's creates an incentive for companies to turn workers into contractors. And it's in the political world, like this is rampant. Like so many people who should be employees are contractors because campaigns don't have money and don't want to pay them. But it's also this huge dampener on business, and like, why, as an employer, I don't want to have to, have this extra tax on every employee that I hire to cover their healthcare. So it's just an inefficient system. And I think like the result of that is we're creating new kind of band-aids to not fix the root problems of the system, but try to like get it to be a little bit better, for workers or for business. But yeah, on Prop 22 specifically, I mean, I'm not like an expert on this stuff, but I am skeptical of anything that will never be amended except by a 7/8 majority of the legislature. That seems terrifying to me. So I would probably not vote for that.
Provision. Well, cool. We're close out of time, so I want to get one more question from the chat. You're obviously one of the few people who's seen sort of the deep inside both Silicon Valley and DC. So what advice do you have for people in SPC with sort of a tech background who do want to contribute to progressive causes, both people who are sort of looking for how best to do that sort of on the side while the election is happening right now, and for people who are interested in sort of bringing their skills to bear on that full time?
Yeah. I think I'll talk about the skills to bear part first. I think, there is a lack of like good people who get involved in politics. And I don't mean that from like a, like what I mean by that is not like the people who are protesting and like doing like there's like a lot of great leaders that organically come up, but most of the people who actually end up with power are like exactly not the people you want to have power, and I think there's and I'm not advocating for everyone here to just like go run for office and take power, but I am advocating, I think, for like take an active interest and figure out if it does make sense, and if you think like you have a real solution, and don't just want to make a career out of it. Like actually, like even in San Francisco, where we have a whole host of problems of our own to solve, like work on that full time and try to figure it out, and don't be afraid to get involved and have a little bit of power. I think it's not good for good people to sit, not be on the sidelines when the bad people will take they'll absolutely use what they've got. On the question of like what can we do right now, a lot of people have asked me this, and my honest answer is I don't think you should necessarily take my advice. I think it's probably, if you want a phone bank and donate money, I would say probably more effective to do that stuff for like Senate races and down ballot races than necessarily just for Biden, just from like he's got tons and tons of money. But yeah, I mean, I'm not like super connected to campaigns. Don't donate to Amy McGrath is the only thing I'd say. She's got a lot of money and she's wasting it. But there's good Senate races out there like Jamie Harrison against Lindsey Graham, and I forgot her name, in Iowa against Joni Ernst. So there's like, there are people who've done more research on this and have actually like come up with good slates of races to donate to and stuff like that, which I have not. So I would recommend talking to them, and I would say like, yeah, support Justice Democrats. I think they're doing really, really good work. And yeah, they've really built on we had a little bit of success in 2018, and they've really built on that. And if you're talking about like, how do we actually get Joe Biden, through this theory of change, like how do we make sure Joe Biden actually like follows through on stuff, having political leaders in power who use their power to really shine it. That's like one of the most effective ways, I think, to make that possible, way more than citizens, unfortunately. Like it's like harder for everyday citizens to like get the news media to pay attention to something, but people in office can.
So one last question from the chat that is maybe relevant is, when are you running for office?
Oh, this is my campaign launch. I forgot to mention that. Should I said that at the beginning? No, I've been happy with raising my kid for now. So yeah, this is like doing the podcast has been like mostly a bit of like doing political therapy while I try to not work on political stuff.
That makes sense. Well, we're just about out of time, but thank you so much. That was super interesting. And yeah, it was great to hear all that laid out.
Yeah, I'm glad. It's so hard to do these on Zoom because I'm like trying to watch everyone's face, but as far as I know, you guys are all just checking Twitter. No, I'm joking. But yeah, this was really fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Bravo.
All right.